Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I'm Mark Schumacher, Executive Vice President of the Home Furnishings Association, and this is our weekly webinar. And I have a confession to make. You know, we all like to be planners. I mean, everybody watching this, you're business people, and so you try to plan. And so you say, let's look at the calendar here. Well, certainly based upon everything we know, the 13th of August would be a great point to talk about the latest stimulus package in DC, because it's either going to be right on the brink or it's going to have already passed. Well, guess what? There's been some curveballs that have been thrown. However, this conversation has never been more important because there are so many things being discussed or not being discussed right now that will potentially impact you and your business. So we're actually happy that we've got this set up today. I've got a couple of guests who you have seen before. I'm going to introduce them right now. We've got Chris Andresen. Chris is the lobbyist for HFA in DC and has been working tirelessly ever since this pandemic started. And also working equally tirelessly is Michael Borden. Michael is the lead of the government strategies team for Sidley and has also had some positions on Capitol Hill as well in the past. So both of them are very much in touch with what we're going to be talking about today. But let me just remind you a couple things. This is being recorded, so this is something you'll be able to share when it's done. Our page is, of course, myhfa.org/COVID-19. That's the resource page that is really the standard for finding information, the latest information on anything that surrounds the retail industry and, of course, the pandemic. Also, you can send us questions. You'll see on the right side of your screen, you got the ability to send questions. We will monitor those, and they're going to be fed to us, and we're going to do our best to answer all of the questions. So that's all the housekeeping. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Chris, I'm going to start with you. Let's just briefly, if we could, from both of you, get a little bit of a temperature check on where we are right this second today. Anything new and different happening on Capitol Hill?
The answer is no, in terms of new and different. And actually, officially, there have been really, high level informal exchanges between the White House and, congressional Democratic leaders, and Mitch McConnell had kept the Senate sort of pro forma session potentially if they needed to come back. But today, as of today, the Senate's officially in recess, ahead of the next 2 weeks for sure, which you've got the dueling Democrat and Republican party conventions that are happening. But basically the positions of both sides haven't changed over the last several days, which is, the Republicans are wed to their initial offer of $1 trillion for their broader package that was introduced by Senate Republicans. Democratic leaders in both the House and the Senate have offered to come down from their $3.4 trillion level in the HEROES Act, which the House passed in May, to a $2-ish trillion package. But at this point in time, neither side is really willing and able to go anywhere but there, and so that still presents a wide gulf between the negotiators on both sides. So that hasn't changed.
Michael, what are you hearing?
I would say the gulf, as Chris described, is right, but I don't think the gulf is necessarily as big as that $1 trillion+ gap sounds, because more than $500 billion still hasn't been allocated. It's been appropriated, it's been authorized but not spent. So the reality is you could actually have the two sides get to a deal where both could save some face, where you spend and you actually authorize or you direct certain funds that have already been authorized to be spent but haven't. You give that suddenly you're at $1.5 trillion+ on the Republican offer. The Democrats say they're willing to go down to $2 trillion. And so suddenly you're not as far off on the dollars. I think the question now is going to be what you're going to spend the money on. And it's a lot more challenging here. I mean, what's changed in the last week? I mean, look, you now have a presidential campaign in full effect. You have Kamala Harris is the vice presidential nominee for the Democrats. As Chris said, you've got the convention starts next week. We're 82 days away, I think, from the election. And so everything's going to be viewed through those prisms. and the two sides now have to figure out whether or not how you sort of motivate your base and mobilize your base to vote and encourage other people to vote for you. And I think that some have made a calculation, Republicans perhaps have made a calculation, that spending another $1 trillion is likely, at least right now, based on what they seem to be suggesting, is not going to animate their base of voters. So there's not an incentive for them to reach a deal because they don't see this as a real crisis. That, you know, unemployment, the new unemployment claims were down below 1 million today for the first time since March. And so perhaps the Republicans are making this gesture to be fiscally conservative now in a way that they haven't been before, or they haven't been over the last 6 months. But I still believe that we are more likely than not, significantly more likely than not, to see a deal, because out of the rhetoric, you sort of tune out the rhetoric. They're actually not necessarily as far apart in terms of the dollars that you know, and they say they are.
So you know, the thing that disturbs me about that is just that
one thing.
It's just that this is now, this whole issue of the stimulus package, you're basically saying is right now is not number one on their radar. Is that what I'm hearing from both of you? That, I mean, let's be real with conventions, with, you know, the election, you know, posturing on both sides, et cetera. I mean, is this now no longer a top priority? And is it second or third on the list? Chris, what do you think?
I mean, it's certainly being viewed through with an eye towards the election in November, and I think that's what led many of us here in DC to be so skeptical about this timeline. And, you know, when we heard from Republicans, and again, this was not something that was a surprise. I mean, we heard all along from Senate Republicans that they weren't planning to negotiate this package until the end of July. And I think many of us recognized the exact problem that we're encountering now, which you just identified, and what Michael spoke about as well, is right now we're within 3 months from an election, a very important, consequential, and in some cases, again, so unpredictable because of this virus, understanding what those dynamics do. And that's what led me to have some pessimism over the last several weeks about reaching a deal. As Michael said, what's the incentive for Republicans as they look at some of these unemployment numbers that are decreasing while still massive, right, when looked at in totality, in terms of turning off their base and spending too much money. And then for the Democrats, you know, if they feel that they have some momentum heading into November, you know, perhaps they see some advantages to holding some of this for potential new administration. I mean, a lot of those calculations have gotten much more complicated and real as you get closer and closer to that November timeline. So that's certainly, while I'd say that, you know, COVID-19 is definitely still priority number one, you know, trying to solve that with the pressures of the election being so strong it's proven obviously difficult because we sit here today without a deal.
What Chris has just said actually reminds me of a couple of things. I mean, first, yeah, COVID-19 is the issue. It's the issue that animates absolutely everything. But as an economic stimulus, really the top issue of the COVID solutions? Is it more about reopening businesses, reopening schools? Mm-hmm. Those seem to be the question. Is it, you know, more PPE, social distancing, all of those things? So those seem to be higher priority issues at the moment than, you know, getting more money out the door. Whether that's fair or not, and whether that's right or not, I'm not judging. It seems to be the case. And then I think that this is something that's the Republicans are considering here right now too, is that this probably isn't going to be the last economic stimulus bill, particularly if the Democrats win in November. If Biden wins and the Democrats take back the Senate, then it's almost certain that you're going to see another huge economic stimulus package in the first quarter of next year. So in part, the reasons the Republicans are, you know, digging their heels in on a lower dollar amount right now is based on an expectation, likely, of a significant multi-trillion-dollar spend in the first quarter of 2020.
So let me ask you guys this. Up until recently, within the last week or so, we knew how things lined up. We knew that the real pet, project, if you will, for the Republicans was going to be the liability protection aspects of this COVID stimulus package, among other things. And then you had, of course, the unemployment, continuation of unemployment benefits as being the Democrats, and there were some other elements we throw in there. So we kind of, you kind of knew what the debate was going to be. Then we have the president come over the top and sign an executive order or two over the weekend, and throws this monkey wrench into the unemployment question by approving additional funds, but question who's going to pay for that. So let's ask about that. That sort of just took what we already knew to be sort of the game as we were looking at it here, and just really kind of blew it apart. What are the impacts of that alone on this whole negotiation going forward? And Chris, why don't you start that one?
I mean, initially the intent, I believe, of the executive orders, aside from providing relief, was perhaps some greater incentive for Democrats certainly to come back to the negotiating table. As you said, Mark, of the 4 executive orders that were signed over the weekend, certainly the one dealing with unemployment insurance has many questions. I know the Department of Labor has issued some guidance to that. In speaking to the specifics there, my understanding is that if every state took the president up on his offer to provide $300 per week additional UI benefit without a state match, that the funding that he's allocated, that he's drawing from FEMA, would expire in about 6 weeks. So that's not necessarily a long-term solution. But it's something that, again, from an optics position, understanding that negotiations broke down at the congressional level, the president felt that he could act. And of course, the Democrats have not necessarily viewed that from a congressional standpoint as a serious long-term solution. And so it hasn't acted as any sort of incentive or motivator for them to come back to the table. It's just something that they continue to say, from the administration perspective, isn't a tangible solution to this particular crisis.
Well, Michael,
right? But perceptions become reality,
okay.
And particularly in a campaign season where people don't. There's going to be so much thrown at us, and if President Trump's able to convince the public that what he's done by himself with an executive order, if he doesn't need Congress to provide stimulus, if he's able to say, I'm able to help you here only so much, and I've done it in spite of the fact that Democrats are opposed, the Democrats might sue, all of these things, he's going to take this credit. Also shielding Republicans from perhaps taking a vote that they don't want to take, that they would say is perhaps fiscally irresponsible. So it also maybe scrambles the incentives in a way that it doesn't bring Democrats to the table, but it also doesn't bring Republicans to the table. Because if Republicans can sell these executive orders themselves as sufficient, then what's the point of passing another multi-trillion-dollar stimulus bill and changing your brand, which used to be that you were a fiscal conservative and small bill?
Of course, one of the things that Chris said, though, that if that relief is only funded for 6 weeks, then this could be something that could also look great for getting us halfway to the end of the election, and then be an issue, later on. Michael, let me ask you this one. When it comes to that executive order, there's been a lot of questions. We've gotten some already today related to the question about the legality of that kind of an executive order. And let's just talk about the unemployment first. I know the payroll, it's tax deferral is another one, but circumventing what appears to be the job of Congress here. Anything you're hearing from that standpoint? Not that there's going to be time to make a challenge, but any thoughts on that?
Well, so there are a lot of, I think, issues potentially with the challenge. The first is who is going to have the standing to sue. So that is a threshold matter, becomes tricky. Timing, of course, is an issue. But then you have what the president is citing is the recent Supreme Court jurisprudence, which suggested that he was allowed to reallocate other funds, certain funds, for purposes of his choosing, building the wall. And so he's going to make, by analogy, the same argument, is that by reallocating FEMA and emergency funds to providing unemployment benefits is within his authority. This is a question that will likely eventually make its way through the courts, but it's certainly not in the next 6 weeks. And do you, if you are a Democratic governor, if you're a member of Congress, if whoever has the appropriate standing to sue, do you want to do that? Is it a politically viable point? But as a practical matter, I saw something today that this is supposed to be a particularly brutal hurricane season because it's 2020. Why should anything be easy?
Right.
And so you're going to have a tough hurricane season, and maybe you're going to deplete FEMA's funds. So just add it to the list. Add it to the list of horrors.
Well, as a matter of fact, Chris, I don't know if you saw it, but I believe that I saw late yesterday or this morning the fact that even a good friend of the president's, Governor DeSantis in Florida, kind of backing off this whole match thing and not wanting to have anything to do with it. And you're not, again, talking about a liberal Democratic governor. You're talking about somebody that's very close to the president. Any thoughts on that? Because this is also an interesting state-by-state dynamic, which obviously has election implications too.
Absolutely, and Michael mentioned the optics, but you're right. I mean, the reality is, so many of these states across the country are, many of them have had their fiscal years just end, so they're making difficult budget decisions on some pretty rough projections for the next, 6 months, year, 18 months, and so. I saw some kind of a projection from the California's governor said under the, President Trump's executive order, if they were to match, that it would cost California under current circumstances about $700 million a week or something to that effect. So these are significant dollar figures, and obviously, given the high rate of unemployment in Florida, which has a very high rate of unemployment right now, and again for the foreseeable future, these longer term investments in unemployment insurance are unsustainable without some additional help from the federal government, which brings you back to the stimulus conversation, which has been one of those primary issues on state and local funding and what they can use the money for. Because when states pay, as employers, people on this webinar today, as employers, you pay into the state and the federal UI trust funds, and those state benefits are paid out of the state trust fund. But once that trust fund runs out, they have to get a loan from the federal government to cover that balance, and then eventually that loan comes due, right? And it's really interesting to think back. And again, 10 years seems like such a long time sitting here in 2020, but we went through this in 2009, 2010, 2011. The federal government spent $450 billion in unemployment insurance benefits during that recession. In this particular recession, for context sake, they've already spent $250 billion on the $600 boost in 4 months. So this is not a new phenomenon, but it's just something that came on so quickly and aggressively. Starting out the year 2020, we thought was going to be much different. And so now, a state like Florida, who has such a severely high unemployment rate without a projection for it to come down anytime soon, they're looking at it thinking, well, how am I going to afford that? And that's the issue that you have. And to the point that we made before, we just don't know which states are going to take the president up on the offer in terms of combining these FEMA funds with their departments of labor. I think, as far as I know, Mark, the only state that's gone ahead and said they will do it has been Ohio, with the $300 without the state match. I know many other states are looking at this, but there's a lot of politics, of course, behind some of the leftover CARES Act money that's out there. So there's so many other issues at play that's what kind of makes the outlook for that executive order, and you mentioned the payroll tax order as well, kind of so murky as we move through.
And the thing that's important, and by the way, we've been at this a lot. I want to remind you, you're watching the HFA weekly webinar. I'm Mark Schumacher, being joined by Chris Andresen, who's our HFA lobbyist at DC, and also Michael Borden, who's the lead of government strategies for Sidley. The thing that's important to point out, and it's kind of what I love about these conversations, is it allows us to kind of think about things a little differently. And Michael, a minute ago, you talked about the fact of talking about if the Democrats have a good election in their eyes, and there could be huge stimulus in January, and that might be tempering the negotiations right now, which to me is kind of nutty, because you kind of have to deal with what's happening now. Here we've got retailers that matter to us who are just saying, we just need something. Give us something. Give us a national liability shield of some sort. We know that some states are passing it, but give us that. They're asking for kind of a mitigated unemployment number because they want people to come back to work and not be incentivized not. And they're saying, hey, give us a back to work. But all these things are important right now. And yet the environment is such that a lot of this is being deferred for what could happen. I'm just getting from retailers a great deal of frustration that their needs are not being listened to at all, and that this is all completely out of their hands. And I know I painted a glum picture, but am I onto something here?
Yeah, you're definitely onto something. Congress acted really, really fast in mid to late March because they sensed impending doom. Everyone panicked, and so everyone moved quickly, and suddenly you passed a $3 trillion bill that was supposed to put sort of a net under the economy, and hope that. But remember, and it's hard to think back now, but in March we thought this was going to be over in a couple of weeks, and that if we all went into our houses for 2 weeks, we'd be able to come out of our houses initially by Easter, then by the end of April, then end of May, and who knows, end of June. Here we are now in mid-August, still here, and so the $3 trillion proved to be insufficient. But it also became a baseline for how they were going to address and approach the problems. They were going to fund lending programs through the Federal Reserve. They were going to offer assistance to small businesses through the PPP program. Then there was going to be some specific direct assistance to airlines and things here and there for individuals. And so now, of course, it's not a surprise, there were a number of businesses, and particularly retailers, who were left out and who couldn't benefit because they were too big for PPP. They aren't significant enough to get a direct grant like the airlines. And so then you had retailers relying on potentially the Federal Reserve and the Treasury to come up with some sort of program that was designed to hopefully help mid-sized businesses. And so it wouldn't be essentially a grant of money like was going to businesses with 500 or fewer employees. It was going to be some sort of low interest loan. Turns out the Main Street program that the Fed has created is totally unappealing to lenders and borrowers. But yesterday you had the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston touting how it's working much better now. It's becoming much more popular. And in the last month, interest in the Main Street lending program has increased fourfold. And we've now made 32 loans for a total of $250 million of the $600 billion that are potentially available. So, I mean, it's a total failure. By any objective metric, the assistance that's designed for mid-sized businesses is a total failure. And so Congress is now starting to at least acknowledge that. You had the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee sent a letter urging basically, and many people have done this too, a reconsideration of Main Street. You have another bill that it's a bipartisan Senate bill called the Restart Act, sponsored by Senator Young of Indiana and Senator Bennett of Colorado, which essentially is a bigger version of the PPP. So it would include mid-sized businesses to provide direct assistance and for a greater range of expenses beyond just payroll. And it has, I think, something like 45 or 46 co-sponsors. But where that's ultimately how we're going to rework the PPP program and whatever comes next could be something like the Restart Act, but it also could be something like Marco Rubio's pitching, which is a focus on even smaller businesses than the PPP did. So for businesses with fewer than 300 employees, special attention to really, really small businesses. You can say that there's merit in protecting small businesses, but again, they did get a first shot at the PPP. They were eligible for funds. Now you can say they might need more, but there are a lot of businesses that haven't gotten anything yet, that have been completely left behind, whether by legislation or regulatory programs, and retailers seem to be the ones who are most squarely hit.
Well, and I'll tell you, this is what I'm going to speak for Chris for a second here. What you just described has been the biggest frustration, because we've had a lot of conversations with the key players in that Restart Act, because we see the merit for our members in many ways. But Chris, what Michael just really talked about here was he really capsulized all of this need in a great response, and yet this right at the moment is not. There's just no life in it. What are you hearing about? Is there viability for Restart or something along those lines going forward when maybe we get something in September, or is it in danger of also just being overwhelmed here by everything else?
It's certainly, the Restart Act is certainly not larger than some of the the election watching that's going on, right? But it was also, I think, part of the frustration for HFA and its members that we had as the talks broke down was that the Restart Act was gaining considerable momentum in terms of being included in whatever package, whatever form that took, right? There, as Michael mentioned, it sort of started out as this germ of an idea, a really good idea for mid-sized companies, and politically it's gained a lot of traction. And I think for the points that he made, which was there were so many companies, businesses, industries left behind from the CARES Act, from the PPP program, and then with some of the delays and misstarts from the Main Street lending program, that was starting to hit home for a lot of senators and House members as well. So it's certainly one of those items that if circumstances were to be such that there was a broader package, could certainly envision elements of that coming into a package, because again, you're going to have to put this thing back together, and as Michael said, kind of building up to that top line figure and what various parties want and in there. I think from our perspective as retailers, we're looking ahead to the fall, right? I mean, we know what we've been through. We know what we're experiencing now, and then of course when you hear the director of the CDC say that this could be, I can't remember the term he used, but something about the most troublesome fall, or just an awful fall with respect to this virus. That's concerning for retailers like the ones here today. And then when you put it in a political context, Congress is supposed to be on recess through all of October. They're here for a couple of weeks in September. So the question is, when things get really bad again, where's Congress going to be? And is there going to be, so we can't necessarily, our perspective has been, we can't wait till that point again. Looking back in March, I mean, to now, right, there were something like under 150,000 cases nationwide when the CARES Act was passed. Now we're over 5 million. I mean, you look at all these other metrics, we feel like we should and we do know more about the virus today. But obviously, looking ahead to the fall, what we've always heard from this onset was that the fall is a very dangerous time. So what we've been saying is, as retailers, as business people, give us that in case of emergency break glass option. So as you're not here to address this problem, give us the flexibility to be able to do it, have these programs in place proactively. That just hasn't been a place historically that Congress has thrived, unfortunately. As Michael said, in March, they were reacting. And very much today, we're reacting, right? I mean, both parties are reacting. The Republicans are reacting to some of these economic indicators that, show that unemployment claims are falling and these sorts of things. But you have to look at the bigger picture. I mean, people are still out of work, tens of millions of people, right? I looked at the comparable data from a year ago. There were like 1.6 million people claiming unemployment benefits. And across all programs now, there's almost 30 million. Businesses, retailers, restaurants are suffering. They're going out of business. Michael mentioned the airlines. These other industries, other industries are suffering. I mean, business is way down, and we don't know exactly when it's going to let up. I mean, there's a lot of talk about vaccines, this sort of thing, what impact that could have. I think that will be positive, but at the end of the day, we still don't know how much of a boost that will be. So that's the trouble as we get. And again, the frustration back to restart is we were gaining momentum. That was an issue that had kind of worked itself into the realm of possibility, and now we're left kind of at a standstill.
Michael, let me ask you a question. And Chris, thanks for that. That really helps to kind of give us a really good perspective on that. Michael, let me just ask you this question, and this is something that's come up in some questions we've had here today. Is it possible that nothing more will happen between now and the November election? Is that possible, that all these things that are still on the table, that it's just going to be, you know what, even in September, it's going to be maybe we agree on sending out some new, payments to people, through Treasury. But is it possible that nothing will happen?
Yeah, it is. Absolutely, it is, because so typically when members of Congress operate with the August recess deadline because they don't want to have to go back and campaign at home and spend a month at home getting hammered for what they haven't done. I wonder if in this current environment where people are generally socially distancing, they're not out on the streets, they're not out at restaurants, shopping malls, wherever, parades, participating in public activities, if there was the same urgency pre-August, and if there will be the same urgency in September. Again, like I've said, there are still a lot of money that has been appropriated but not allocated. And so the administration will still be able to say there are things they can do. And in fact, if you go back to early spring, that was one of the reasons why when Treasury was first allocating money to the Fed, they didn't allocate all of it. It's because they wanted to save some money to see how the markets responded and save it for a rainy day. So the rainy day might come in September and October, and that's potentially why they haven't allocated some of these funds. So yeah, I think that they have that pot of gold, if you will, but it's not huge, but it's something. It can perhaps get them through the election, but post-election, there is not going to be a ton of incentive to move quickly. You're a lame duck Congress, perhaps a change of control in the Senate, perhaps a change of control in the White House. People might just say, let's fund the government through the end of the year and just move on.
And Chris, I just can't imagine for the retailers that we serve that's going to go over well. That just because the status quo at the moment, I don't know that that's really satisfying for a lot of the businesses that we're talking about. I know you're not only talking to folks in the Hill, but also a bunch of retailers. What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And Michael's right in terms of now we do have this recess. You've got these conventions which are going to distract these members, but at the end of the day, nobody's really going to these conventions this year. So it's a different set of circumstances. But Mark, our strategy, pre-pandemic, and then during currently in the pandemic and post-pandemic, I think will remain the same, which is we have to let our members, whether they're House members or senators, know exactly how this situation is impacting our businesses, our customers, our employees, and just the gravity of this crisis. I think we can, as Michael mentioned, back when the CARES Act was passed, Congress didn't appropriate enough money initially to the PPP. They didn't understand that part. They didn't give enough flexibility to business at the outset. They didn't understand that part. And so there's I think that there is a little bit of a disconnect in terms of what the urgency is on Main Street, back in their districts, compared to what they may hear and see from some of these, macroeconomic indicators, because the reality was everything shut down so quickly and so forcefully that coming out of that, things were going to look a little bit more positive. But that doesn't mean that we still don't have a lot of concerns, a lot of deep concerns for the viability of these businesses moving forward, and at a time when again we need it the most as citizens, as business owners. We need the federal government to help, because this is something that nobody forecasted, and then nobody has really been able to kind of guide through and come out of it yet. And so those sets of circumstances demand some sort of action from Congress. And I think that going from the CARES Act to the House passed HEROES Act, which again, whether or not that was a viable option, it was something that the House Democrats passed, which you have to give them credit for. The Senate Republicans weren't able to do that. They don't have anything really, hard and fast to negotiate on. And I think that that's kind of what made these negotiations different this time. The House Democrats had spoken. They had put down their marker. They passed a bill. That's not insignificant. The Senate or the Senate Republican conference was a little bit scattered. As Michael said, there's several members that don't think that spending $1 trillion matters. It should be done at this point. There's other members that are perhaps more vulnerable come November that believe that a deal that has to be cut. But those are the circumstances we're dealing with politically, and unfortunately, for us in DC, it's what we have to live with. But I think that that sort of posture and dynamic doesn't translate as well to retailers and business owners across the country who are trying to keep their doors open, serve their communities, pay their employees, and and provide in this case a home experience for people that are at home more, kids at home and going to school, that sort of thing, making sure that those environments are sustainable and prepared. But that's got to be a frustrating thing. All we can say is continue to deliver that message. And I think we've been doing that in an effective way over the course of this pandemic, through various forums. But at the end of the day, that's what the members of Congress need to hear. Inaction is not an option.
I agree, and it's interesting. And Michael, I'll share this with you and everybody else, because Chris already knows this, but everybody else that's joining us, is that we have a government relations action team, and we meet consistently, and you can just see an amount of fatigue that is set in as these retailers, these very active retailers, have been really trying to push and get their voices heard. And I think that when they hear the possibility of this dragging out through the end of the year, potentially without really anything of substance, that's going to be a weight that's going to be interesting for them to bear. Here's the question. Do you think, and Michael, I'll throw this one to you, do you think that if there is no deal, does that hurt both parties? Because we're talking so much about the balance of power and what may happen after November. Does that hurt both parties? Is it a little more complex than just thinking, well, the Democrats didn't step back up because the president did something? Well, I mean, there's a lot of members of the Republican Party on Capitol Hill that are not happy with this either. But who does it hurt both, and if so, in what quantity?
It's a good question, and before we just get so totally bleak, let's
throw us a line. I'm feeling some fresh water coming.
Let's not give up completely. I mean, I know the Chairman Mao riff, that it's always darkest before it becomes totally black, is we're not quite there, because okay. 12 years ago, so take us to 2008, Fannie and Freddie failed on September 7th. A week later, AIG and Lehman. That started the next 5-6 week process, which took us to about October 10th, where Congress and the White House negotiated what became the $700 billion bank bailouts in the TARP program. So it's not that we're not dealing with game over here. Mm-hmm. It's not game over. And so, as you and Chris were just saying, it's frustrating for sure. And for your active members, it's really frustrating because Congress is working on its own timeline rather than one that seems to fit the business cycle or the needs of a number of businesses right now. Congress moves at its own pace in its own way. And so just because something hasn't happened yet doesn't mean that the answer is no and that it's over. So just let's keep that in mind, because 12 years ago, with the bank bailouts, no one imagined it. And it was sort of like, it was in many ways, it was more analogous to March, when you had a couple of cataclysmic events that happened and Congress reacted. Here, Congress has had months now to think about it, but we're not finished yet. And the question of who's going to get the most blame, who knows? It's a really good question, and it's one that I think is probably more. This is such a cliched cop-out answer, but I'm going to cop out.
Okay.
The news cycle changes so fast in this year that what happens today is forgotten tomorrow because there's another new crisis or another major issue. I mean, it's just so true. Who remembers impeachment, right? That was in January. The president of the United States was impeached, had a Senate trial, and could have, well, I mean, he never was going to be removed from office, but there was a vote to potentially remove the president of the United States from office in January. That feels like a lifetime ago. No one thinks about it, and no one remembers it. So if Congress fails to pass some sort of economic stimulus package in September, is that going to determine the election? I don't know. And I don't think, is that what Joe Biden's going to be running on? I don't think so. Yesterday when he announced, Kamala Harris, that was not a focus. That really wasn't the focus of their message. It was a bungling or mishandling of the virus and the health implications, but it wasn't that, Senate Republicans and the White House have refused to spend $3 trillion. And that wasn't it. So I'm not sure this is necessarily going to be a major political issue. I just am not. And it's going, people are just focused on the virus in different ways. They're focused on health and they're focused on schools. And I don't know if they're nearly as focused on small and mid-sized businesses getting a lifeline to stay open. But that also could be because individuals were getting, unemployed people were getting, big checks every week for the last few months, and those have run out. Will they have saved this money? Will businesses take advantage of the payroll tax deferral? Even so, are people going to then just start spending it and forget, hey, at the end of the year, I'm going to have to pay it? I mean, there are lots of potential issues here and lots of potential problems, but I'm not sure that as a political event that these are necessarily going to be the number one or number two issues.
You've kind of convinced me that I wish it was a political issue, because then maybe we would get some action. And I want to point out, Michael, by the way, and Chris can back me up on this. I am incessantly on a day-to-day basis, maybe the most person, always half full, that kind of stuff. And I was going for what's the bleakest scenario as a way of kind of backfilling from there. But I love being called out on the fact of that I was suddenly gloom and doom. I love that, and you're right. That optimism, we have to have it. That's about the only fuel in the tank that we get sometimes. But it is interesting that you're right. This is not a, for us in our little, in our closed world of home furnishings retail. It's not a small world, but I'm just saying in the overall scope of things, there's such a great deal of importance in all of this, and unfortunately we're yelling and not being heard right at the moment. But no, I appreciate that very, very, very much.
You're not alone. But you're not alone,
Yeah.
Mark. I mean, I think that's important to remember too. You are not the only ones who are screaming at members of Congress that they need to do something. You have, from the commercial real estate sector also has been entirely excluded and explicitly excluded from assistance. You have shopping centers, landlords, tenants, you have hotels, restaurants, basically any consumer facing business is struggling. And it is only going to get worse unless there's some a miracle vaccine soon. And look, I'm ready to hop on a plane to Moscow and get my shot. I'm ready. I'm also willing to drink bleach if that's what it'll take. But
Michael, you're killing your credibility now. I can't have that if you're going to be on our webinar.
Trump is banking here a bit on a miracle cure, that somehow there is going to be news of a vaccine, and we're going to be able to say that the Oxford vaccine or the Moderna vaccine or whatever, we're going to be able to announce in October that these things really work. And so everybody just hold on a little bit longer.
Mm-hmm.
Just hold on, and we're going to get this silver bullet miracle shot in our arms, and we'll all be able to leave our houses. We'll all be able to go back into a store. We're going to be able to buy a new couch because you've worn it out, because you've been sitting on it for 8 months. It's just, that's the hope. I don't know if that's a policy, but that seems to be
the hope, right?
It seems to be what's going on here. And maybe hopefully they know something we don't know. Hopefully they know something that we don't know.
Let's hope. I want to remind people you're watching the HFA weekly webinar. I'm Mark Schumacher, joined by Chris Andresen and Michael Borden. Let's dig in our final quarter hour here. Let's dig into one of the two issues that came up over the weekend. And Chris, I want to start with you on this. Let's talk a little bit about, what we do know at the moment are these orders were signed, that the payroll tax issue, which on the surface seems great unless you really understand how it all works and about how that's a deferral and how that would be repaid. Talk a little bit about what you're hearing also about the delicacies there and the concerns there in how that's going to play out.
Absolutely. I mean, broadly, there's a lot of confusion. Okay, and a payroll tax deferral is something that the president pushed heavily for in whatever this next COVID package would look like potentially. He received a lot of pushback from both Republicans and Democrats in Congress on that. And for the details here, it would take effect. This order on the payroll tax deferral would take effect September 1st through the end of the year, and it would apply to workers making less than $100,000 annually. So basically, under $4,000 every 2 weeks. And the issue is that you already have a payroll tax deferral on the employer share of the payroll tax, which total is funds Social Security trust fund. Okay, it's a 12+% tax that's divided equally between employers and employees. So this order would apply to the employee share of that tax, and under a normal, like, congressionally mandated payroll tax holiday, the employer would not withhold that 6.2%, that employee share, so that would be extra money in that employee's paycheck. Under an executive order situation, there's no guarantee that deferral will not be due to the IRS at the end of the year. And so as an employer, if you don't withhold that money under the CEO, you're potentially on the hook to repay all those payroll tax deferrals at the end of the year, which is not a great situation to be in. You don't want to be in a situation of, asking the money from your employees. That's just not going to happen. And then, heading into next year, your employee's first paycheck in January would, the tax withholding would go up, so their paycheck would go down. They'd be a perceived tax increase. And so those are some of the reasons that mechanically Congress doesn't like that. And so it's left a lot of those questions to the Department of Treasury and the IRS as they implement this order. And the question is going to be, how many employers are going to take advantage of this, trying to move through the uncertainty. I know that the U.S. Chamber has asked, the Treasury for some direct, guidance here. And again, it goes into effect September 1st, so I would expect that there would be guidance on this in the coming days and weeks. But all of that confusion, again, kind of adds to everything else that you may be facing in the fall. And I think it's confusing to both employers in terms of what their obligation would be in this scenario, but it's also confusing to employees, like, hey, am I going to be getting an additional 6% in my paycheck? Because if I am, I need to know that. That'd be good to. But then, what is that money going to? And again, this particular payroll tax is the main funding mechanism for the Social Security Trust Fund, which people have, policymakers and others have questions about its solvency long-term to begin with. Those are some of the things that have been raised lately. So it's just a lot of confusion. I think some of it can be cleared up with some of this guidance from Treasury, but it's again, not, as the Democrats would say, it's not necessarily one of these long-term viable solutions to this particular crisis.
Michael? I think everything that Chris said is completely right, and complete. I guess one thing I would add, and it's just on the sort of theme of executive orders and governing by executive orders, is watch out. I know that in the members of this association, for example, have international supply chains, and as an understatement, and I've been told by Trump campaign officials and administration officials to expect an announcement of punitive actions against China and Chinese companies every 3 to 4 days between now and election day. And so that'll come in the form of executive orders, like came last week on TikTok and WeChat, and they're going to, with odd implementations, and the notice that you get to comply is that it'll cover a transaction that they'll define within the next 45 days, and that will then have immediate effect. These can be broad or they could be narrow, and but they will all, in the immediate term, cause maximum chaos and disruption. And so, just like this executive order on the payroll tax, you've got to be really mindful that every few days there are going to be other executive orders, statements, administrative actions, regulations, impositions of sanctions. I mean, and they're coming, and it's going to be all the time, and they can be really disruptive. And so, in addition to having to manage a pandemic, you're going to have to manage an administration that is looking right now to punish China in every possible way for the China virus, the destruction of the US economy, human rights, cheating on trade, intellectual property theft, everything. And it's going to almost certainly, between now and November, directly impact all of you.
Well, there's maybe the biggest headliner of this of our talk today, that you're hearing directly from the administration about that kind of a cadence. I mean, that's incredible. That's between now and, if I do the math, that's about 20 actions at least, well, 20 to 30 actions between now and election day. Holy smokes! I mean, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Wow.
And look, this summer, Congress unanimously passed a Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. They passed the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, which both have mandates on the president to take certain actions. So those can come. Today is the implementation day for government contractors to pull or to stop contracting with entities that use Huawei or ZTE telecommunications technology, or Hikvision, Dahua, or Hytera video surveillance equipment. They want to continue operating and doing business with the U.S. government. That came today, even though the rules haven't gone into effect. The rule, it's a totally screwed up mess. So there's your China news 3 or 4 days after the executive order news. And there is also this summer, they released a DoD list. The Department of Defense sent a letter to members of Congress identifying 20 companies that are operating in the United States. Generally, they're technology companies that are tied to the, quote, Chinese Communist military. So they're an obvious set of 20 targets for other penalties and people who do business with them. And look, this is all designed to be disruptive. Bring manufacturing back to the US. I mean, you're going to hear about supply chain issues all fall long. And so I think that's a really important issue to be very mindful of. Here we are talking about COVID responses, but this is something that is more likely than not going to be like a cherry on top of problems, because even if the government's going to give you something, they're also going to be making life much more difficult.
And supply chain issues have gotten increasingly more difficult, particularly from that part of the world, and that's something that all of our members have been struggling with, small or large retailers. Chris, I'd love to get your reaction. I saw you kind of jot that down when Michael talked about that. What are your thoughts about how that can sort of season what we're talking about here and everything going on in the Hill?
Well, I mean, it certainly plays, again, back to the election card, right? It's one of these key issues for the president as he takes on Joe Biden is his position on China, especially when it comes to these 301 tariffs that we've been so active on as an association over the last couple of years. And that's really, to the extent that the Trump campaign has a defined set of issues to go against Joe Biden. Certainly the situation with China is probably number one. So that tracks with, again, everything that we've seen recently. And I think that, quite honestly, it's shifted Joe Biden's longstanding positions on China and our relations with them, because obviously he has a long-standing in government, long history, but even his campaign, Joe Biden's campaign, has said that he would not necessarily relieve the 301 tariffs if he were to be elected. He'd look at them, but that that's sort of a shifting issue. And again, it's all tied into the origins of this virus. And I will say this, one thing that the administration has done, it's not just an American issue. They've rallied, countries in Europe, other countries around the world on this sort of anti-China bend. So that's been interesting to watch. And again, we're watching it play out, perhaps more aggressively over the next 80 days.
Yeah, as Chris, just to amplify one thing that Chris said, don't think that a Joe Biden presidency changes overnight the way the U.S.-Chinese relationship. You think Joe Biden on January 20th and 21st is going to reverse executive orders that President Trump has imposed against China? No chance. Why would he politically do it? So he could be called soft on China and Republicans would have an issue for the next 2 years? Talk about how Joe Biden's soft on China? No way. So it's going to, and frankly, even if he wanted to, members of Congress there's sort of a bipartisan unanimous consensus that we've got to be tough on China. The bills that I've mentioned passed unanimously. They passed unanimously this summer. And so there is a consensus to continue to be tough on China. So don't expect that somehow just because Trump is no longer in office, there might be a difference in approach. There might be a more muted way or a more tactful way of dealing with China, but don't expect it to just be some 180-degree reversal and back to the previous order.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I want to remind people of a couple of things here. First of all, that of course, if you would like to review this or share this, it's going to be up on our COVID resource page, myhfa.org/COVID-19. Also, you can continue this discussion by joining our HFA Retailer to Retailer Facebook group. I encourage you to do that. Also, on the right side of your screen, you're going to notice that we also have something that you can download. It's a handout. It's called the HFA Benefits Guide. It is something that you should review because there are so many reasons why membership in HFA matters to you as far as really helping you save a lot of money for running your business. But also one of those things is advocacy and how we are pushing all of the issues that are critically important to you as a retailer there on Capitol Hill through Chris's work and others. And it is just really an important piece. And gosh, in the last few months, it has been absolutely critical. So here's what I'm going to suggest to both of you. Okay, so if I call you and we reconvene this trio here in September when something is about to be passed, fingers crossed, you're going to say yes, of course, because we've got to finish this conversation. But I just appreciate you guys joining us today because there's been some really great takeaways and good conversation. And this is what everybody's talking about. And you've really given us context today, and I appreciate that. And Michael, I thank you for the information on China. That's good for us to know as well as we move forward. But once again, Chris Andresen, HFA's lobbyist in DC, and Michael Borden, who's the lead government strategist for strategy team, I should say, for Sidley. I appreciate you both, and we will continue to lean on you for some great insights, and we will continue under Chris's leadership to continue to have that steady drumbeat to push the issues important to home furnishing retailers on Capitol Hill. Gentlemen, thank you very much. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Hope everybody stays healthy. And for all of you joining us, I hope business continues to be robust. I'm Mark Schumacher. Thanks for joining us. We will see you next time.